Hello everyone, today we talk about the passage from ancestry to lineage, right, during the, essentially from the 10th to the 11th century, which is a crucial moment, as you know, in the definition of very important political and juridical prerogatives in post-Carolingian Europe, which is essentially what we're going to look at, right? And obviously ancestry and lineage are something that you can anthropologically spot by certain degree already before, naturally also afterwards this process, but the definition of essentially an elite, right, that would go on for, at this point, almost a millennium in the rule of great part of the European continent, from properly a political, military and social eminence, is one of the key moments in European history, which is all in world history, which is all the more striking when you realize that this happened in a spontaneous way, fundamentally, in the wake of a political institutional reality that still existed from a theoretical point of view, but that practically formed essentially through a further privatization of a system that already didn't, spark for, public culture by itself, but that in fact is also different in the aside from the essential characteristics, also differs in the various post-Carolingian kingdoms that in fact here we're going to outline in their transformations. And it's as always essentially France, Italy and Germany, even if we're talking about given the name of the modern countries, but as you know here is essentially Western Francia, Eastern Francia, and the Lombard kingdom, and in a broader sense, however, expanding in a further, right, as a broader cultural model that, as we were saying just recently and in other videos, will eventually take over a bit the whole Western world. So this moment between the end of the 10th and the beginning of the 11th century is in France. So I will say, instead of Western Francia or Francia, we'll say France, Germany, Italy, so that we understand each other, and the same goes for other regions. It's very important in terms of the political and juridical structural changes, also because the feudatory, that is the title holder of certain rights that he had been provided with by royal concession, is not anymore the secular temporal beneficiary of the king, but now fundamentally the heir of assets and powers that he can transmit to his children. So the parental relations that modify at this point and are reflected in the political system, for example, through the fractioning and the localization of same power, or public power. So thus the gradual inheritance and privatization of the still namely public offices, right? And also on the economical level, right? For example, at this point there is the stop of that regular repartition of the inheritance among the male heirs that, for example, in the region of Mahon in Burgundy had made such that a property originally divided among 4 families could result shortly afterwards repartition among 24, right? So this idea came to an end, right? It's paradoxical in a sense that the same Carolingian but also the Merovingian empires had collapsed for the same reason, because essentially the Frankish dynasts imitated by the rest of the Frankish people. It has to split their own the inheritance of their father equally, right, among the male sons, and this would essentially result into the political fragmentation of the state. It was considered, in fact, at that point, nothing short but a private possession, right? Dynastic, if you want, at that point, but still connected to that specific bloodline. So, in fact, as we will see now, the idea of lineage is not really new, right? It's just that, on average, right, there was a prevalent custom that had survived in spite, in fact, of the dramatic development of the hierarchies, especially properly in the Frankish heartland, meant in the kingdom of the Franks. And this is even more evident in Neustria, where the actual base of power Merovingians and Carolingians laid, and where the greatest concentration of goods in the hands of fewer people was already a thing since an early age, right? And so this practice came to an end essentially in favor of the firstborn son, right? And if this had happened, it's like before, it's likely that the same Merovingian or Carolingian say empires properly in their imperial nature, not just the kingdom of the Franks, where that exercised such imperial power, would have lasted more, right? And it's paradoxical that this started in a more concrete sense, and sedimented and consolidated from the moment of greatest fragmentation, right? And this naturally responds to needs essentially of unity of command, right? And that in this regard were a necessity due to the same political fragmentation more than else, also to the second invasions. So that is, you can't really still quarrel against each other for that equal inheritance when, if you don't stick together cohesively against the outer threat, you're going to lose everything altogether, including not just the assets, but your own life, or your freedom, for that matter. So this brought, as you understand, to the unitary management of the office as a model for, in turn, a unitary management of the family assets, which fundamentally overlapped, because as we've seen, these public prerogatives now were seen essentially as a private thing, de facto. And this mold is what feudalism, as we know it, will stem from in its more accomplished political and institutional phase, in spite of the survival, namely of a public authority of some sort, that, however, was at that point shaping essentially in the same way this private dynasties. And this doesn't just happen in post-Carolingian times. It also in other circumstances. I don't know. I think of the same. I don't know. Think about the collapse of the German monarchy in the 13th century. At that point, essentially the monarchs had surrendered their own public rights to cash for structuring a private domination, like the dominion, like the other princes of the empire, and that's why historiographically we call what came afterwards as princely Germany, because effectively it was really not a state anymore, but just a federation of different powers, most of which emerged from a dynastic background. So it's a bit the same thing in a way, and it takes different forms historically, right? For example, in the Roman Empire, also it was never quite a dynastic, as you know, in spite of the deep privatization that occurred from earlier times into the late antique and eventually the medieval times. It was never really such a thing like a dynastization of power, even if de facto this existed, but the broader political and social structures wouldn't allow it by a certain dimension, and still that could be more cohesive than other realities. So it's not really a matter of what model you use, but how this model concretely functions, and especially how people decide to operate, to cooperate, to say better. So the gradual decline of the state in late Carolingian times had accompanied itself to a fracturing of jurisdictions, of fiefs, of immunities, and in the case of the family, to an accentuated patrilinearity induced by the same imperial legislation. And of course, the overwhelmingly famous, say, milestones in this were the 877 capitulary of Quierzy-sur-l'Oise by Emperor Charles II, and especially the Constitutio de Feudis, or also known as Edictum de Beneficis of 1037, issued by Emperor Conrad II in Pavia, that, especially the latter, marking a definitive transition towards the acceptation of a certain private prerogatives, in a sense. That is, the first one was about the inheritance of the larger fiefs, right? The latter recognizes the smaller ones. So at the point that it wasn't just about co-opting the most important elite, but essentially telling that everybody was somewhat regularly to consider the fiefs were still recognized as essentially something imperially provided legally, but however as something that would have to be inherited legally and regularly without any problem at that point. And this is interesting because it reveals, if you want, still the ambiguity that had existed in this. As you understand here, they are it is like 1 century and a half, but that's where most of the change had factually occurred. So we're talking about ensigns, lands, and privileges that were now transmitted from father to son. And now that the man is not anymore the beneficiary of a good, thanks to the occasional favors of the sovereign, but the heir of such good, right? Well, he is thus pushed to give more importance to the male, say the vertical male line of descendants, rather than to a horizontally fluid group that could grant him some honors dispensed with the favor of a patron. So in a way, it's been said by Duby, for example, that there wasn't something properly like ancestry before that the honor had became freely hereditary, right? And so the familiar consciousness is as if it had been a consciousness of heirs, right? It's a bit radical as a take because ancestry was still thought to exist, but indeed the narrowing down of the basis on a familiar, if not properly at a linear level, like in fact from the lineage would emerge, is something that in fact hadn't quite existed before in this world, right? Because it would have seen it was considered as unfair fundamentally towards the other sons that were all to inherit equally, because they were free men in a sense. Now, the dynasticization, so the linearity, the inheritance, in this regard provides with a more also easily recognizable center of power, paradoxically, even though this was the moment of greatest fragmentation, so that you also realize that now the post-Carolingian world was being rebuilt from the bottom up, right? Sometimes, very often, from the same monarchs in this regard, but not only. And the same imperial legislation privileged the Aniatic lineage when it established that the father, could succeed in the fiefs in such order sons, grandsons, and father's brothers, right? So the idea is that if you had a great grandson, right, your brother would have been more eligible for inheriting than him had your sons and grandsons died in the meanwhile, right? So still the Agnatic line was recognized as pretty. This went on for a long time, up to the 14th century. We were seeing that, for example, in that video we made recently on the Duchy of Burgundy, because both, let's say, the proximity and the male line were still both valid such a later time. So this tells you how objectively the thing had somewhat remained fluid up to that point, but still on a linear base. Doesn't matter how you know, the direction proceeded from to, but substantially that the idea that there had to be an intact inheritance that had to pass largely, by the way, to a specific person rather than to all the others that were in theory equal to them on a genealogical level, such as, you know, children of the same father, etc., was important, still with an Agnatic connection present. So that naturally, this you can see also in the Carolingian family at some point, right? There were some smaller powers, like the same Charles II, Charles the Bald, that issued the Capitol of Quierzy-sur-l'Oise, was a guy that had essentially, as a, you know, been carved a smaller power than his other brothers-in-law, as a smaller concession for still being son to Louis the Pious, but not quite having the same rights of inheritance. So there are, and eventually he rose to top in other ways. But let's say to see how such eventually this was part of the same reason why some civil wars among the same Carolingians had broken out. Right? So that tells you, even at that high level, where dynastization was more, you know, of a normal familiar culture, at that level of power, how still could, you know, with the original idea that everybody had inherit equally was felt, and it's kind of obvious because, you know, there is always a sense of, you know, if I can't earn more, why should I be second, right? This was alien to certain cultures in general, probably among the Germanic tribes that had kind of maintained an egalitarian mentality up to, at least, you know, somebody like the same Merovingians and Carolingians had taken power, dynasticized and dramatic, but still, culturally speaking, they hadn't quite been able to give up to that idea, by in a certain sense. And the patrimonial element of it, the economical value of such difference is kind of the most understandable. And so the nobility of lineage is born now when the families that already lived at imperial court were rooted within a certain territory, and the new familiar Agnatic behavior became thus in turn the model for also the lower classes. Say that that would appropriate themselves of the same when the title holders of the countess administration render themselves autonomous from the few based principalities born out of the disgregation of the empire. That is to say, the comites, so these essentially the standard rulers, right, of the administrators of the core provincial district, let's say, of the empires, realized that, as given that they were factually provided with, you know, power over the land, their military clienteles, their revenues, etc., they were exercising de facto a concrete power. We made videos about this in general, explaining how, yes, this is in turn the consequence of that lack of public structures that was typical of Frankish society, right? The well-vassalitic beneficiary system was based on a prepaid, let's say, service, so that you fundamentally provided the guy with the basis of the resources that were necessary for providing essentially military service in the army. That's what the whole empire was based on. And so these people would be, yes, provided by the king some land that, in that moment, however, they were the only ones that ruled factually when they were provided with. And the kings did this because naturally, by not having a real state, they didn't have much else but private clienteles to play on, right? Also within their own internal competition to rule, to have some bond, of in fact, of trust. Thinking about the Lineage later on, that in this sense, they were properly felt that somebody was connected through. Why all this emphasis on feudalism, on the investiture properly of the ceremonial, etc. Because it lacked any other kind of effectiveness. It had to become something ideological, which surely already existed in the ancient war bands, in the comitatus, that in this, in fact, military structure that the empire just was the largest version of, for which, mostly was the methods of still, as we were saying before, the threat posed by surrounding peoples, etc. Say, okay, we have to stick together so that we can effectively go in the same direction successfully and survive in the process. But this was difficult in the moment in which the Franks had basically taken over everybody in Central Western Europe, and that you already have just lots of counts endowed with their own land, that at that point you didn't have any force at the moment of overextension of the empire but to just hope that they wouldn't turn against you. Well, that's exactly instead what would happen, and that's the reason of the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in the first place, right? Not saying it was unavoidable, but in a sense, right, it was a miracle that it had existed in the first place, and this miracle was based, not surprisingly, on the fact that both Charlemagne and Louis the Pious had basically outlived all their siblings, and thus they had nobody to share their own property with, right? And not surprisingly, these were also kind of the more enlightened Carolingian rulers that tried to centralize further, mostly using the church. That was the only, in fact, not kind of inheritable good, even though the clergy still was drawn from exactly the same kind of nobility, of secular nobility in all things, including military customs associated. But yet there was some greater, organizational value in the church, in the ecclesiastical administration, in the connection with Rome, and so on, that was seen as a sound investment. That's also, in fact, why so much power was accumulated by the church in post-Carolingian countries altogether, even there with different dynamics, but fundamentally to be still so powerful. I mean, throughout all the Ancien regime, and even beyond by a certain degree, aside from the strictly cultural importance of Christianity in itself, and necessity from a moral and ideological and disciplinary point of view. So in that moment in which a lesser nobility had been created out of those functionaries that already governed the fortresses on behalf of the king, and that now they essentially retain simply a private control of, and in the moment that is also later, in which even as we've seen with the Constituzione Feudis, even the least, let's say, nobility obtained legally to transmit agnatically its own honors, even though it had de facto already happened. So that it was just the formal legal sanction, or reality by the early 11th century was already that one, right? Think it also properly from a material point of view. I mean, these people were in control at that point of so many fortifications of the same land. There was all an infrastructural system that the Carolingians had based their military on, that now was literally taken on by privates and that they could use in their own way. That's also why knighthood, is kind of born in the same period, and together with the same nobility and the same, in fact, lineage as we intended. So it became properly a broader cultural concept. The idea that these were superiors, right? They were elite. They were aristocrats. They were superior biologically. They were superior military. They were superior morally. That's the idea that gravitates around, the Wallensian regime gravitates on. These people are leaders of men, right? And so they have to have extraordinary qualities on their own. And the biological connection is important because, of course, that's the moment in which had kind of already existed in previous times. Don't think that even in tribes in the ancient world there wasn't something like kind of even a proto-racial idea of what, some peoples were superior to others or not, right? That is, nobody talks about it, but it's actually very, very, let's say, self-evident and overwhelmingly documented historiographically that this was the case. But surely that proto-racial contempt, proto-racist, we could probably say contempt, towards, for example, the peasantry, towards those who were not noblemen, right? They were literally nothing, right? Because they were factually nothing, right? At this point, this families took over. And what was a peasant compared to a miles, right? At this point, maybe already something, but I always say never underestimate the military capacity or the political capacity altogether, the peasantry, especially at this point, right? The big defeat, inappealable disaster and subjugation of the peasantry happens essentially with the 14th century, right? At this point, peasants are very active, very dynamic. Actually, they don't feel inferior to the nobility from their own point of view negotiationally, but it was evident that surely, just already a knight was starting to be worth so many other peasants at some point. So it was starting to become evident from an individual point of view. Those people were less in a way. So, and in parallel, this is why the lineage is so important also from a cultural anthropological point of view, because this is the way in which a cognatic society that recognized all the biological lines created by the filiation and the matrimonial male and female alliances was transformed in a society rigidly based on lineage and on male parentage, we could say. Not that this doesn't exist before, right? That this had been all patriarchal societies, right? It's just that we'll see before. Normally, it was still, say, a preeminence that the woman could possess on behalf of her, essentially, in fact, of her ancestry, in a way. And in the lineage system, it kind of worked, but in the same way, meaning that, of course, a queen was more important than a female peasant, the wife of an average milas, right? So that factually, in the negotiation power of marriage, she had a much greater value as an individual, but still she was, of course, as it was traditional, even before the lineage, active in essentially through the just through male decision about that. But still, in this sense, if she had been allowed to marry somebody of lower status, she would have been legally seen as still with some ambiguity, though, however, subjected to her husband in that regard. regard. But this wouldn't quite happen in that proportion, right? So of course there were different degrees, of course, of let's say the different levels of nobility hierarchically. Then, as it would gradually also consolidate, especially during the late Middle Ages. So these are roughly the causes of the transformation to the aristocratic family that we know historically in the West, right? And it's obvious that at the lower levels of society, the dominant model was still nuclear family. Now, this is important to understand that the nobility here worked like as a clan, as a mob, right? These are the aristocrats in medieval Europe are extended families. They're big groups. Sometimes they are not even, they're not even all noble within them, but they still have a higher value because they still belong to that broader family. The peasants, in general, but also simply because they had less assets, were living in nuclear families largely. This is documented. I think we made some month ago a video on the Carolingian peasant families, what they were about concretely in terms of family structure and so on. Now, Schmidt connected the birth of the lineage in this sense, and the dynastization of the family, to the dissolution of the Carolingian court and to the rooting of the familiar nuclei properly within the territories where they had up to that point dwelled, or simply where the greatest land asset concentration laid. And this was accepted also by Duby in the process, and in fact he reconstructed the French parental structures, confronting the genealogies derived from the surviving documentation that gives us essentially a biological image of family, with those produced by so biological view of family meaning properly the idea that what mattered there was properly the blood tie, right? And so and with those produced by other contemporaries that were closer to the family mentality, from which they began to constitute their own self-representation in a way. So on the basis of this comparison from sources, it's evident that, for example, the men preceded the women, the firstborn, the cadets, in that the maternal parentage is named only in case, as we were saying before, in which the female ancestry was socially superior to the one of the man, right? So these this images, let's say, just like the documentation surviving, do not, however, let's say, are not to be found up to a certain date, right? Which confirms that in France, before the 10th century, family was not yet analytically structured. Furthermore, while the genealogical memory of the comital families arrived, dates back to essentially the beginning of the 10th century, that of, for example, the castle hoarders, the chatelain, etc., it stops to the 11th, right? So you understand that these, especially, these were often not even real freemen, but maybe servants. Usually they had made a career under the noblemen that had entrusted them with the administration of a castle, and then maybe the master died, or eventually they received that administratively as as inheritable good, and they became even part of some of the most important noble families in Europe later on. Even less, the milites families do not date back their genealogy, but up essentially to the mid 11th century. So this is very important because the miles at that point was not technically just the ultra heavy, hyper powerful knight, etc. They were just, you know, pretty tough guys, essentially professionals at that point, but still not particularly rich, right? They were essentially the retinues of these masters that didn't quite have, aside from the pay, the loot they would receive, really assets on their own. So a chatelain could be more important than a miles per se, right? And because he owned the freaking castle and the land attached. So the process of dynastization appears more precocious, of course, in the more noble and powerful families on average, right? The familiar structure is modified more precociously when there are goods and honors to preserve. Because it had to adapt to properly to the legitimization of the control on such reality to keep it together, right, more strategic. It can be thus be stated that the political and parental structures were connected by an organic connection, and that the genealogical awareness appears, consciousness, say, appears in the moment in which wealth and power assume more decisively a patrilinear trait, right? And therefore, as Schmidt said, that the household of a nobleman became the independent and lasting center and point of consolidation of a lineage. So, the fragmentation of power in France and Germany is accompanied to lineage, right? Albeit in different times according to different degrees of nobility, but there is a reinforcement of the dynastic process starting especially from the end of the 11th century. That is evident also in the royal lineage, as there are some dynasties that fundamentally consolidate the linear transmission of the crown, but it's a wholly political, let's say, acceptation. Still, you know, in Germany, the crown was elective. So, in France, it was way more dynasticized, but still, Hugh Capet had to be technically still be elected by the nobility as a broader, still as the things back in the day, right? You know, so that was still in spite of the concentration of power in the single dynasties and the different degrees of such effective power in the country, still in theory this had to satisfy the subjected community's consent in a way, approval. This goes on for the whole Middle Ages, and further in theory, right? It was at the base basically all the juridical, monarchical theories. I mean, it's something we have seen especially in medieval law series. And it's evident, for example, that in the case of incest that were caused by the kings to solve those matrimonies that put in danger the continuity of the lineage and the power of family not having given fruit, right? Which naturally allowed the dispersion of the patrimony of important households, right? That the king hoped to take control of in a way or another gradually. Well, it's exactly the way through which it was favored the consolidation of a dynastic consciousness and the verticalization of parentage in the same way, right? So that there was no way to fundamentally trying to unite certain assets that were to be to remain according to certain families, just within their own close circle, right? There could be some dynastic process for which this patrimony had to go out of the same group in other ways. And with the Gregorian reform of the church brought to important changes, also by influence of the Bishop of Paris, Petrus Lombardus, 1095-1160, because it didn't just limit to condemn, for example, the marriage of the clergy. That we made a video about. That was still widespread in certain countries. It was just traditional, and the Gregorian reform came as if, that this has always been the rule. Why do they even care? But it was important in that sense because, especially north of the Alps, it was this dynasticization of the same ecclesiastical patrimony through the marriage of the clergy, which was, a custom widespread also in the lower classes of the same clergy. But it also, controlling marriage here was essentially a way to subtract it to the political gain, right? So imposing, for example, the consent of the contractors of marriage, and for example, the sworn oath of witnesses that had to confirm that the future spouses were not connected by by a parentage within the fourth grade, right? And there were, however, still other problems. For example, the presence of cadets, so-called the martyrs of the first geniture, let's say, that found limited space. For example, in the Crusade adventure, they were essentially trapped in the ecclesiastical life, and the many non-married girls that eventually were to become beguines, etc., because their dowry costed, so fathers were not to pay for their marriage, and they wouldn't, they were confined here in this kind of, ecclesiastical life. Also in Italy, the fractioning and delocalization of powers of command during the time of the disgregation of the public power brought to essentially the disintegration of the fortunes and the assets and the rooting within particular territories, together with the fragmentation of the familiar nuclei that is particularly intense in the region, both for the custom of dividing the lands still among all the male sons, right? While in France, already from the 11th century, it was the tendency to favor the firstborn son, and because the cities, right, the more urbanized reality, kind of put a break to the process of territorial recomposition, and because they have more control on the rural areas where normally, like in France and Germany, that was the base of power, and the churches, right, that are center of seigneurial power per se, so they interfered with the presence of the nobility in the process of territorialization. In other words, in Italy, the city always put a halt to the development of a stronger feudalism, like in France and in Germany. So the Italian documentation allows not just to reconstruct genealogies starting from the 8th century, right, because the land was much more literate, and people had per capita more wealth, so we have a, documentary speaking, a much better section, a documented section of the Italian politics and society, but also to spot the presence of a parental order, right, between the 8th century, the 8th and the 11th century, both among the high nobility, that among the simple freemen, right, and and in fact, within the latter social class, the same names repeat. That is, every family has a few particular surnames, right? While the surnames proper are not yet determined by personal characteristics, but they are usually simple double names. So this tells you how much freemen still had greater juridical power fundamentally, and how there was not quite a dynastization, right, of a certain households that took, kind of this broader prerogative over, the mass of the rest of the population. In spite of this, there is, the degree of the still present degree of dynastization in Italy is quite precocious, right? And people said, there are these are big topics historiographically speaking, because there are debates on this, and some said, this might have been because still the prejudice that still the Longobards kingdom was not quite united, was divided in duchies and things like that. This is not really correct. It's rather the fact that on the contrary, the public districts were somewhat more functionally operating, in spite of, for example, rural assets or things like that, or at least, even if they were, they still maintained their own functionality in many areas. So the nobility was never quite capable of completely taking them over, right? And there were more fragmented dynasties, and this, let's say, niches of power were built spontaneously, mostly from the lower strata, and this is important, so that still local power appears generally autonomous from central authority, which tells us that still central authority has progressed a bit on its own. It's like later on, right? The idea that the city goes on, even if there are still feudatories in the countryside, right? And they're not yet completely, they're never completely divided, but still there are two parallel fields of development that put, as we've seen, a break to the same creation of great dynasties, with, say, a deeply rooted entrenchment in their own territories, like as we've seen in France and in Germany. In fact, it is important that the royal and comital powers are fundamentally in this reality a bit less detached from the rise of single dynasties that appear mostly forming through a patrimonial strategy rather than some connection with the public government, let's say. And here, in fact, the scanning of the public office, dynastization, and territorial principality becomes a more messy set of dynastic developments, right? There are the hegemonical areas, certain public districts that they interact and they affirm themselves in parallel, right? Thus, every single, for example, marginal district becomes a principality, or some hegemonic areas become public districts, or the border of the same are modeled according the allodial centers of the family, right? So the same dynasticized office title is first applied to the offices and eventually to the districts, and only eventually to the hegemonic areas where the family had its own allodium, the clienteles or benefits. The allodium is fundamentally that part of land that assets that are kind of factually inalienable even from public authority, and this do not quite overlap usually. And so the double nature, for example, of counts and marquis, right, as official representatives of the emperor and landlords, creates even remarkable variance on the familiar development depending on the prevalence of this or that model, right? And also the struggle for the Italic crown, the Magyar invasions, the Saracen ones also, the distance from imperial power, but mostly north of the Alps, especially in the reactivation from the 10th to the 11th century, right? Even though essentially local powers such as Spoleto, Verona, etc. had competed, had gotten an imperial title on their own, even in Provence that had intervened in Italy and so on. Well, this prevent, right, to the comital districts to transform themselves in general in political territorial areas provided with a coherent and autonomous integrity, because the great families essentially go on into territorial ruling without caring about the public title itself, right? That in fact is not yet consolidated within them at the same time. And this happens for essentially the more evenly distributed wealth, right? So that there is not the necessity to concentrate, like there is not properly the possibility of concentrating too much wealth just in some place, right? The economy is more diversified, it's more monetized, for example, it's more connected with the city, with other communities. So this lineages do exist, but they're somewhat more floating in the market, if you want, rather than entrenched or essentially building their own lineage on the base of a public office per se. For example, the encapsulation in Italy is notoriously more of a political and economical thing, dynamically speaking, rather than a structured program of fortification, because I don't know, the Magyar invasions and so on, right? There were people literally building castles and selling them as a business because they, at that point, they were growing that fast and that autonomously and with this more fragmented base that there was literally a market of such things there. So this naturally accompanies and favors the formation of territorial rural seigneuries at the same time, in parallel to other centers of power. And the jurisdiction on the dependents in the earlier case is widened up to incorporating quite soon all those that reside or gravitate around the seigneurial nucleus. And the public system is not any more organized according to the Carolingian principles. It's de-articulated by a certain degree because of the powers that Otto I granted, or more simply recognized to some bishops, especially from the cities, as counts eventually, because that was the only way effectively to control the peninsula. So Italy already looks like a very wide polycentrism of autonomies with different outcomes, right? For example, episcopal principalities of German type, territorial principalities of French type, and seigneurial rural seigneuries and communal dominations intersected according to the Italian type specifically. So there is in this broader situation naturally some precarity and instability, especially between the 10th, 11th century, right? Especially from a political point of view, because centers of powers are aggregated and disgregated, are easily abandoned. For example, the same story of the Canossa family, right? That tends to reinforce itself through mostly private powers, because the public ones are not dramatically solid in this picture, and it has also not just a need to, let's say, it has a need to extend its power in order to preserve it, right? So at the same time, it needs to concentrate forces in order to achieve this. and this brings to their own dynastization, right? And only this, by essentially scrupulously protecting its own descendancy, its own descent, the family can affirmate itself against the other powers, like against the king, the emperor, that wanted to seize their own goods, properly as a family, right? But not everywhere the lineage structures can affirm themselves in virtue of their capacity, for example, to inhibit the demographic liberty of the family members. In fact, if women are all provided with dowry and thus married, the aim to close, say, contact with, having alliances advantageously, right? In France, starts precociously and by essentially